Subhas opposed the proposal of dominion status. And Jawaharlal Nehru also supported Subhas in that. And Gandhiji was livid. But as was the pattern with Jawaharlal Nehru, that after initial disagreement with Gandhiji, he would always go back and surrender to whatever he said. But Subhas was a bit different. Subhas would not surrender. He would continue. Interestingly, what we see there is Gandhi writing to Sardar Patel that I don't find Subhas trustworthy, but there is nobody else who can become the president this year. When he sent to Japan through the submarine and reaches Tokyo, Prime Minister Tojo was not ready to meet him. It was with a lot of difficulty that one brief meeting was arranged for him. And all it took for him was that brief meeting. Within that brief meeting, Tojo was so thoroughly impressed with his plan, with his personality, that, I mean, out of the blue, he promised all cooperation, all help, unconditional. And Subhas was blunt enough to ask him that when you promise help, it has to be unconditional. So that is what makes Subhas Bose stand out from practically all other leaders. And that is what made him such a cherished leader across Southeast Asia. He was so ahead of his time. He gave the slogan that India must think of herself first. He gave that slogan in 1939. And we saw that slogan being picked up again and used when Prime Minister Modi campaigned in 2013. Sardar Patel boasted in front of a foreign correspondent that I made sure that not a single INA soldier was taken back into the Indian army. Sardar Patel was also sending out letters to provincial chief ministers, premiers, that praise the INA, defend them, but there is no need to praise their leader. At least Nehru was honest towards the fag end of his life when he spoke to one foreign correspondent and admitted that he had let Subhas down. And he made clear that the choice between me was Gandhi and Subhas, and I could never leave Gandhi. So I had to go against it. But he did admit in as many words that I did let Subhas down.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste, I Mithilesh and Sumit welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have noted historian Sri Chandrachur Ghose on our show. Today we will discuss Chandrachur Ghose's book, Bose, The Untold Story of Inconvenient Nationalist. Welcome, Chandrachur.
Thank you, Mithilesh. Thank you, Sumit. It's a pleasure to be on your channel.
Thank you. There are not many Indian heroes whose life have been as dramatic and adventurous as that of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. That, however, is an assessment of his life based on what is widely known about him. Now, new information throws light on Bose's intense political activities surrounding the revolutionary groups in Bengal, Punjab, Maharashtra, and United Provinces. His efforts to bridge the increasing communal divide and his influence among splintered political landscape. His outlook and relations with women, his plunge into the depth of spirituality, his penchant for covert operation, and his efforts to engineer a rebellion among the Indian armed forces. With this new information, what appeared to be dramatic now becomes more intense, with plots and subplots under one man's single-minded focus on freeing the motherland and envisioning its development in a new era. Pacey, thought-provoking, and absolutely unput-down level, Bose, The Untold Story of an Inconvenient Nationalist, will open a new window to many hitherto untold and unknown stories of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. Chandrachur Ghose is an author, researcher, and commentator on history, economics, and environment, having graduated from Vishwa Bharati and the University of Sussex. Ghose has co-authored Conundrum, Subhas Bose's Life After Death, which featured among the bestsellers on Amazon. So this is the book. This is one of the best biography ever written on Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, that also answers difficult questions of colonial history of India hidden from us. So I would urge my viewers to go and purchase this book and Do not put down before reading it completely. So, Chandrachur, what led you to write a comprehensive and new biography of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, and why it is the story of an inconvenient nationalist?
Well, Mithilesh, thank you for the wonderful introduction. And let me correct Sumit, who introduced me as a historian. I'm not a historian. I'm an amateur, you can say a jack of many trades. And I see historians are trained in a specific way and they take pride in it, but they're also prisoners of their trade. That's a big problem, and it's not the case that historians are objective and very impartial analysts of data and facts, because very often, more often than not, they have their own worldview and preconceived notions as well, and that's what reflects in their writings. And that is something which has happened with Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose as well. We're looking at the biographies which have been published since uh, independence or even pre-independence, because the first biography of Netaji was written somewhere around 1926 or 1927, while he was still in the Mandalay prison and just 30 years old. So he was important enough at that stage only to merit a biography. It was written in Bangla. But if you look at the major works, major biographical works on it, you will find that they more or less revolve around the same set of events, incidents, uh, pattern which we follow in writing our series. So I was born there. My education took place in these and these institutions. Then he came to Calcutta. He went to England, came back, joined the national movement, and was exiled first to Mandalay, then to Europe. He took a position contrarian to the Gandhian worldview, Gandhian political view, and naturally that led to a clash. And then he became the president of the Congress, and again that clash accentuated, aggravated, and he formed his own party, Forward Bloc. Then went out of the country and formed the Azadin Fauj, the Indian Legion, and uh, along aligned with the Axis powers, he led a military campaign into the British Indian territory. So these are the broad contours, the broadly known facts, and which are well known. But even with this limited information, his bravery, his courage, his valor stand out so uniquely, so distinctly in comparison to the other set of nationalist leaders, that his image has remained intact in the hearts of Indians. Although there has been a very consistent effort on behalf of the successive governments since the independence to play down his role, to suppress information about him. So if you look at the information on Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and the narrative built around him, you will see that it has been predominantly controlled by uh, two groups. First is the government of India, successive governments of India, predominantly led by the Congress party and his own family, Netaji's own family. The result has been that if you compare the availability of information that is easily accessible for a common man, that in case of Netaji is far less than compared to say Gandhiji or Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So today you can sit down on internet and with a few clicks of the mouse, you can access the complete works, the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi or the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru, the two series of selected works that are there, and you can read them and easily accessible. But compared to these collected works and selected works, Netaji's published works is minuscule. It is about one tenth of Gandhiji's work, and one third of Pandit Nehru's work in terms of printed pages. So that itself is an indicator of how little information is out there in the public domain. But to make it worse, even these volumes are not easily available always. You will get certain volumes, a few volumes, but not all of them. So detailed knowledge, comprehensive knowledge about Netaji, because of this limited availability of information and the official uh, marginalization of him. These have led to a lack of information or lack of awareness about the true character of the man, the complex personality that he was. And it has also kept him away from the mainstream political discourse. So, I mean, many of your viewers would know that Anuj and I have been working together along with our friends in Mission Netaji for the last 16, 17 years on the disappearance of Netaji. But while working on the disappearance mystery, I realized that his life itself was no less a mystery because there were so many unknown facts, there were so many gaps uh, which remained unexplained, unexplored. Not all of it was secret. A lot of it was kept within secret files, which have been declassified very recently. But even those parts which were public and publicly available, they had not been explored properly. I felt that there is a link between the life and work of Netaji and his disappearance mystery. The conclusion of the disappearance mystery, the resolution of it, the final solution that we have arrived will not be comprehensible, will not be understood properly if you don't grasp the personality of the man, his political views, his vision, his thought process, his nature, his inherent nature, his spirituality, his thoughts about secularism and India's foreign relations. So all these aspects, if they are not comprehensively understood, not put in the proper perspective, the disappearance mystery also remains largely misunderstood. So there are many questions which come up when we talk about the disappearance mystery, but the starting point has to be understanding a proper understanding of the man. That is where I started planning this book many years ago. I had to give up in between because of our intense engagement in the disappearance history part, and a lot of things were happening, and didn't have the time. I was working full time consultant, an economic researcher, and business strategy consultant. So I didn't have too much time to work on both these things. But then after I left my job, after I quit my job and took to writing properly, then I decided that this book must be finished. It must be done. And proper, full facts to the extent possible. Still, all the facts are not available. A lot of information is in the hands of private collectors, private individuals. A lot of information are still being held by the family, the Bose family, which are yet unpublished. So we still don't have the full picture, but uh, I tried my best to consult as many sources as possible. And this was made easy by the declassification process in India, opening up of the archives in other countries, and thankfully, because of technology, the digitization of contemporary journals and newspapers. So all this played a role and helped us understand the personality of Bose more completely compared to what was possible even 10, 15 years ago. That is the reason why I wrote this book. Now, coming to a second question, I mean, why and why did I name the book an inconvenient nationalist? The Subhas Bose was a nobody's man. He was his own man. He was his own person. He had his distinct political thoughts, distinct political ideology, which did not subscribe to any particular ism. So he was neither a communist nor a fascist nor any ace. I mean, you cannot put him into any one bracket. He was striding across ideologies. For him, if anything, if there is any ism which can define him, it is nationalism. Because For him, India's national interests were supreme, and everything else contributed to that. They were subservient to India's national interest. So whenever he talked about, I mean, very apparently very weird stuff, kind of like a combination of say fascism and communism, which he explained later what he meant. But even when he was using those terms, they were only meant to serve India's national interest. He was not wedded to any particular uh, ism. So he was not like a communist ideologue for whom communism is the end goal. For Subhash Bose, India's development was the end goal, end objective, and any other ism would have to serve that end objective. So we should not. He was not ready to work for establishing communism. He was going to work, or he was working to establish India as one of the most powerful nations in the world. So that was his point of view. But when you take a path like that, you create many enemies. And from the very early phase of his political career, he took up a fight against the Gandhian leadership, the Gandhian high command in the Congress party. So that went on as long as he stayed in India, his work life in India, uh, till end of 1940 or January 1941 when he ultimately left India for Europe. That continued. But as time went on, as the political landscape started evolving, new parties started coming up, like the Congress Socialist Party, the Hindu Mahasabha came into politics, the Muslim League became more and more powerful. So he was working, he was trying to create a bridge through across these parties. But again, as he was not working for any particular interest, any particular group, every political formation had some problem or other with it. And the extent of these problems were so deep, so big, that it continued even in free India, in independent India. And as a result, Subhas Bose has been marginalized, particularly by the Congress party. Although other parties which have been in opposition have tried to sing praise for him, even they have their own set of problems. So Subhas Bose did not belong to any political formation, any political grouping. As a result, he has, and nobody could ignore him, given his stature, given his achievements, given his popularity across every segment of India, every section of India. No political party could ignore him. So they could neither swallow him nor could they throw him out. And he remained there, floating somewhere and being inconvenient to all political parties, all political formations. That's the thing, that's the characteristic, that's the unique feature which I thought was very important in defining him. So that's the reason why I named the book Inconvenient Nationalist.
I mean, many people don't know. I mean, you have already written a lot about him, which obviously people don't know about. I mean, for instance, you talk about how he wanted to join the 49th Bengal Regiment, and then you also talk about how he joined the university unit and got military training. So, yeah, I mean, so it obviously shows that he had an inclination towards going into military in some form or the other, right? Armed struggle definitely was in his blood. That's what it seems like. So, how did it happen?
See, I mean, it was not only a fascination for uh, the military aspect. Well, that was one part of his thought process. But the key aspect, the key element in this was his insistence on being disciplined. And his take was that military training is essential first to give a sense of self respect to yourself and to uh, accumulate a sense of discipline, taking orders, following orders, living a routine and very disciplined life. These were very important elements for him. And if you follow his political career, everywhere, even he was when he was talking to students, uh, youth and students, which were his main constituency, he was constantly hammering on the importance of discipline. And even when he was talking about the combination of fascism and communism. There, he was when he was talking about those authoritarian ideologies, he was insistent on bringing that disciplinarian element within Indians, among Indians. Because one thing we often tend to forget while we judge him retrospectively, we judge him from today's perspective, today's ideological point of view. But he was working and living in an India which was almost destitute, living in utter poverty. The almost an overwhelming majority of Indians were living in utter poverty. They had no access to education, healthcare, jobs. Agriculture was in a mess. So all these problems were there, and yet he was trying to develop India into an industrial trajectory. In all these things, he took discipline as a founding stone. Therefore, he insisted on that military training part. But apart from that, he was very much aware, very much keen that he was aware of this fact that Indians were not armed, and did not have the common Indians did not have training in arms. They did not have access to arms. They did not have training in arms. So at the back of its mind, it was always there to raise uh, forces which would ultimately join hands, different groups would join hands and rise into an armed uprising. So that part was there. So, but he also argued that Indians were not really aware or keen about military training. So military history was not part of their mindset, regular mindset. And it was very important to bring in that martial thought, that martial component element into the regular routine thought process of at least the educated Indians. That's the reason why he went for that training. It was very important for him at that phase. I mean, he finally could not get into the Bengal regiment, but he took the training. Finally, he got the training in the university when he was in the Scottish Church College, and he always admitted that that training, that particular phase of training, did him a lot of good.
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, obviously, I mean, this guy is right. I mean, he's doing military training, and but spiritualism, right, was
Yeah.
also a big part of his life. I mean, there is this guy, I mean, who is getting into military training, which is very materialistic, right? And then you have the same person whose personality involves a lot of inclination towards spiritualism, which is like literally anti-violence. So how did how can one mix these two things together?
Well, see, military training is not materialistic entirely. It's not entirely materialistic. It is there is, as I said, there is a core element of discipline, and in spiritual sadhana, when you go into sadhana, when I mean there are different phases of spiritual engagement. One is that you keep reading books, and the way most people do in today's world, they read a book and then they go and put it out their learnings and whatever they interpret into social media. Then they love to talk more about it rather than follow a rigorous process of sadhana. So whenever you want to enter that channel of sadhana, you have to be disciplined. So it's the at the basis of both the process, whether you are getting into military training or whether you are getting into spiritual training. Without that rigorous discipline, you cannot make progress in either of these fields. And for Subhash Bose, it has to be understood very clearly that his engagement, his involvement with spiritualism was not theoretical. It was not an intellectual engagement only. It was a, a quest, a thirst that came from his soul. So from the very childhood, he was looking at things, I mean, which he had studied in Vivekananda's writings and speeches, and he wanted to progress on that path. So he leaves home, he runs away from home uh, as a teenager. in search of a guru without telling anybody in the household, without informing his parents. I mean, that by itself is a very, very daring step. And without that thirst for actual hands on practice and learning, sadhana in the spiritual field, nobody would do that. So that shows the line of spiritual engagement that he followed. And when we see when he's in Mandala jail from 1924 to 1927, he is reading voraciously on all the sacred scriptures, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Tantras, the Puranas, everything he is reading. He is reading, and the as his colleagues in the Mandala jail, the co-revolutionaries in the Mandala jail who stayed with him and later recounted the story that he created a small room with a curtain, and that was his puja ghar. That was where he would do his sadhana, he would do his puja, and that was isolated. So he was not only theoretically engaging with religion, he was proceeding towards hands-on practice and sadhana. This sadhana is very important to keep in mind because theoretically, intellectually, later he criticized both Gandhi and Aurobindo for taking the path of spiritual disengagement. So Sri Aurobindo went to Pondicherry and set up his ashram. Gandhi set up his ashram in Sabarmati. And he accused both of them of taking away the cream of the youth, educated youth, uh, away from the field of karma, the field of action. He, at that time, while he was doing his sadhana, he was also in a very, very big dilemma. And in his letters to his closest friend, Dilip Kumar Roy, we constantly find pictures of this conflict that Dilip is asking him to come over to Pondicherry. He's saying that if I go, then I will not be able to return. So I don't want to get into that. And at the same time, he's criticizing that this is a time when we have to think of our country, we have to think of the people, which Deshbandhu Chitranjan had termed Daridra Narayan. So the poor people whom we are here to serve as politicians, and the salvation of the country, the freedom of the country, that is what we have dedicated ourselves to. Now we cannot just drop it and run away. And he was very, very critical of both Gandhi and Aurobindo about that. And obviously, they didn't take it easy, they didn't take it lightly. But that conflict was always there. And when we come to the post 95 scenario, or even towards the end of 1945, when the World War is coming to end, and we find from the writings of, say, the Burmese premier Ba Maw, that that element. Mama was not familiar with the spiritual angle, but he could see how deeply spiritual he was, how deeply he was contemplating taking up the life of a sannyasi. Even when the war is going on, amongst his busiest schedule, we find Subhas Bose going to the Ramakrishna Mission regularly, spending hours in meditation and sadhana. So it's not a theoretical thing. I mean, if you follow Gandhi's spiritualism, which is more theoretical and, I mean, a daily practical level application of some precepts interpreted by him. But here we see a completely different path. Here Subhash is not giving lectures on religion and spirituality to his colleagues or his followers or anyone, but he is following it himself. But then I mean, while I'm talking on it, let me also point out this thing that his religion was not only individual, but also a very public one. It has a public face. He would never shy away from claiming his uh, heritage, his linkage, his proud linkage with the past. He was very proud of it, and he constantly told the students and the youth that unless you are proud of your civilizational past, unless you are aware of the glory of your civilizational past, you cannot build on the future because the British rule is going to denationalize you. That is what the British rule has been doing. So it is more important that you are absolutely informed and aware of your civilizational past. And here, he would not shy away from calling him a Hindu or showing him as a Hindu, not like the current crop of secularists uh, who feel very hesitant to call themselves Hindu or to show themselves as a devout Hindu. Subhas was a very devout Hindu, and the proof of his public uh, show of his faith we find multiple times, and most importantly during his jail time. During his many of his jail terms coincided with the biggest religious festivities. So in Mandalay, it happened with Durga Puja and Saraswati Puja. When the government did not give the money for it, he went into a strike and he wrote a scathing letter to the Burmese government saying that, while you are paying the Christians and the Muslims to help them observe their festivities, their religious practices, why are you discriminating against the Hindus? So, and same again in Kolkata, in Alipur jail, we find that he's fighting with the provincial government to allow him to do Durga Puja within the jail. So, his public appearance was never distorted. Individual and public faces were not different. So many people like to say that okay, he was secular. He wanted to take everybody together, which is very true. But think of somebody today. It's impossible to find that somebody who is in his private life very devout, religiously, constantly into sadhana, publicly not shy of talking about his own religious rights, about the rights of his own religious community, and yet being able to carry along with him men from all religious communities who had unquestioned loyalty towards him. That makes him unique, and I mean, I don't think anybody comparable is available in the pantheon of the freedom fighters who stands to that kind of image.
Yeah, he was part of, right, Bengali culture, and at that point of time, as you say, right, the Bengali culture itself was very tightly associated with Ramakrishna Paramhans or Swami Vivekananda's life and their teachings. It was really.
Not only that, there was the Brahmo Samaj also, and the one of the biggest uh, proponents, the adherents of the Brahmo culture was poet Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, and it is not a very well-known incident, but in 1928, Subhas ran into an altercation with Tagore over Saraswati Puja in a Brahmo hostel, where the Hindu students in the Brahmo hostel, in the Brahmo institution, claimed that they should have the religious right to do Saraswati Puja. And the hostel authorities refused permission, and the college authorities refused permission. It became a big public issue, and so was publicly sided with the Hindu students. He said that, people should be allowed to follow their own religious inclinations and their own religious practices. There should not be any discrimination like that. That because it is a Brahmo institution, you should not allow Hindu students who were anyway majority in the hostel and all. So he took his position very clearly, categorically. He he never circumlocuted, or he never beat around the bush. So there were multiple stands, and he was engaging in the same way with Islam. He was engaging in the same way with the Christians. So, I mean, of course, his natural tendency was the Shakta sadhana. But if you look at through his letters, he kept writing to his friend Dilip again that sometimes I'm confused whether who's my Ishta Devata, whether it is Kali or whether it is Vishnu, whether it is Shiv. There are times when I cannot make up my mind. So various strands of religious thought, not only of Bengal but of entire country. Whatever the region of origin be, he He assimilated the religious strands, several religious strands, and kept experimenting within himself.
How did this guy, became IAS? What was how did his interest uh, generated in administrative services, but then he was a politician?
He became an IAS with great reluctance, becoming an ICS, civil servant, but was not even his plan. It so happened that he wanted to go abroad for further studies, and his father put the condition that he can go only if he appeared for the ICS exams. And when he reached England, he had only 8 months to prepare. Now, 8 months to prepare for the ICS is a Herculean task. I mean, not only not easy, but almost impossible. And then he had taken up his course in Cambridge University. He was studying also. So both the coursework and the ICS preparation went hand in hand, and he was engaging in political debates and other cultural life. Although again he was living a very disciplined life, uh, but just those 8 months of preparation, that speaks about the intellectual caliber of the person. That with his reluctance, uh, with those 8 months of preparation, he stood forth, and he stood forth after, uh, I mean, leaving his Sanskrit paper incomplete. Because what happened in the Sanskrit examination was that the question paper, the translation and all that was there, he was asked to translate. The students were asked to translate passages. So he did the translations in rough, but didn't have time to copy those into the final answer sheet. So had he been able to do that, instead of standing fourth, probably he would have come first. So even with reluctance, if we can achieve that kind of result, then it talks about the intellectual caliber of the man. Becoming ICS was never his part of his scheme, and he communicated with his elder brother Sarath Chandra Bose extensively on this aspect, and he said that I cannot serve these colonial masters. India needs to be free. So I need to go to the other side. I need to serve the people and not these masters. So I cannot serve them both at the same time. So there is no question of my joining the civil service. And the problem was with his parents. Although his mother understood his sentiment, his father was pretty uh, adamant that he must join the civil service. So all the time that it took to convince his father through his brother Sarath, that was the only time that he took that went on between his results and his resignation, when he informed the government that he was not going to join the service.
Well, so what was the role of Deshbandhu Chitranjan Das in Subhas Bose's life, becoming as a revolutionary politician?
Deshbandhu Chitranjan Das was one of the most unique political personalities in Bengal's life, and his early death in 1925 perhaps is one of the most tragic uh, events in Bengal's history. Had he been alive, things could have moved very, very different. And as it happened, Subhash, when he came back from Cambridge, from England, and he had made up his mind to join the national movement. Even before coming, he had communicated, he had written letters to Deshbandhu. Deshbandhu had replied. So Subhash offered himself for the national work. He wrote down very clear plan of action for the Congress, how the Congress should reorganize itself, how it should create new cells for research and publication and public outreach, dissemination of information. So for a person of his age, so he was just 24 years of age at that time, and thinking so far ahead in reorganizing Congress shows how deeply he was thinking. And Deshbandhu obviously, he liked those ideas, and he called him that come and join the national movement. So when Subhas came back, his ship docked in Bombay, and at that moment, Gandhiji was also staying in Bombay. So the first thing he did was to go and meet Gandhiji and had a chat with him. He had very specific questions for Gandhiji. And Gandhiji patiently replied to all his questions and all. And Subhas felt that Gandhiji's ideas, his views lacked clarity. He was not very happy. So Gandhiji also advised him that you are going to Calcutta, so go and meet Deshbandhu, and probably you will find a good leader in him. And that is exactly what happened when he came to Kolkata. Deshbandhu was traveling at that time. He came back after some time, so they met and all. Uh, and Subhas had these friends who had already joined Deshbandhu. So they introduced Subhas to him, and he was bowled over even in the first meeting. He knew that he had found his leader with his personality, with his thought. Deshbandhu was a literature, a poet, a novelist, a writer, a philosophical thinker, a Vaishnav by religious inclination, and a leader of men. He was obviously he was a barrister and a phenomenal legal practice which he had given up at the height of the non-cooperation movement. So he was a leader of men, and he was, although he was working with Gandhi at that time, his main line of action was not in line with Gandhi's thoughts. His thoughts were pretty different from, and the clash that happened later on was on this point of entering the councils, the legislative councils, where Deshbandhu argued that against the idea of Gandhi's triple boycott of law courts, educational institutions, and assemblies and councils. Deshbandhu said that we cannot, if we stay outside the councils, then we are giving them a free field to the British administrators to pass as many laws, whatever laws they want, and we won't have any say. Rather, the better strategy is let us get into the councils and stop all their uh, efforts. We will not let them pass any law which we don't like. So that is that way we can completely neutralize the new reforms, the new act that was in place, the Government of India Act 1990, and we will be able to completely destroy it, demolish it, and prove to the world that it doesn't work, that they are by force occupying our land, our people, and we are not with them. So that the clash happened on that point, and obviously Deshbandhu started the new party along with Motilal Nehru, the Swaraj Party. But even before that, just after that, once that party was formed, they started participating in the elections. So Deshbandhu won the Bengal provincial elections in a major way, and then he won the Calcutta Corporation elections. So when then he became the mayor of Kolkata, and here he appointed Subhas as the chief executive officer. So uh, and Subhas got his first administrative experience, hands-on administrative experience to run the city, the second city of the British Empire. Kolkata at that time was considered the second city after London. So he was in charge, and the reforms that he thought about municipal governance were amazing. They were years, decades ahead of his time. So he was talking about market reforms. He was talking of free primary education, generation of gas for street lighting, uh, improving roads, reforming the canal systems, the riverine systems, so that they can serve multiple purposes, and so labor problems. This plan was so detailed and so comprehensive, but he got only 6 months before he was thrown into jail and packed off to Mandalay in Burma. So all this experience, and Deshbandhu also appointed him when initially he started his initial work. Deshbandhu appointed Subhas as the principal of the National College, which he had set up, and Subhas got the experience of teaching the students who had come out of the formal schools. So it was a new kind of experience that he had. He was put in charge of publicity of the provincial congress. That was another kind of. So Deshbandhu was preparing Subhas in many ways, and he always used to say that this is my right hand man. This man is going to be my successor. And just wait and watch to what heights he takes the national movement to. So he was extremely proud of Subhas, and he made him go through the rigor of rising from the ground just because he had come. Obviously, there was an image, there was a glory attached to it. Oh, I mean, he comes from an aristocratic family and he has quit the ICS. So all those images were there. But Deshbandhu made Subhas go through all the rigors of political career and rise from ground up. So that those lessons he never forgot. And the other key thing that he learned from Deshbandhu was to how to bring different communities together. Because when Deshbandhu died in 1925, regardless of their religious uh, affiliations, all communities, groups, they grieved his death. That here was one man who could have brought everybody in Bengal together and probably India together. And the communal aspects, the communal riots and all, which immediately after Deshbandhu's death, they flared up again. So as long as he was there, he these communal tensions and groupings. And that was one lesson which Subhas learned firsthand from him and which he applied in his political career. So this one molded Subhas. And Subhas grew out of it, of course. That's a part of growth. That's the way he was. But his basic learnings were from this.
What was the role of Subhas Bose in changing Congress stance from demand of dominion status of India to full independence?
Well, that was the key fight that he had with the Gandhian leadership. Because when the British government appointed the Simon Commission in 1927. They announced the appointment of the Simon Commission. Before that, also, they had thrown a challenge to the Congress leadership that if you can, why don't you prepare your own constitution? Bring all groups together because the political environment was very uh, faction oriented. There were splinter groups, there were different interest groups fighting with each other, communal differences. So the Britishers, while they worked to aggravate the differences between communities and groups, they threw the challenge to the Congress leadership that why can't if you can produce a constitution by yourself and let us see whether you can find an agreement amongst these groups and communities, and then we will see where it goes. So even when they announced the Simon Commission, uh, they threw the challenge again. So a new committee was formed under Motilal Nehru, which was called the Nehru Committee, to frame this constitution. And Subhas was a member of that committee. It was a small committee, and Subhas was appointed a member. He was selected. And the committee, amongst other things, recommended dominion status as the immediate goal. As but then Subhas explained that it is not the goal of the country; it is the basic common denominator of different groups because there were many different groups with different ideas and different objectives. It was important to bring all of them on a common platform. And Dominion status was that common platform because, I mean, it might sound very difficult to believe today, but there were a large amount of groups and people who did not want complete freedom. They argued for dominion status. So they wanted to continue the relation with British under British subservience. So, but nonetheless, I mean, whatever their opinion or whatever their views, they were Indians and they had to be brought onto a common platform. So there was the crux. Subhas signed that report. But when that report was brought for discussion in the 1928 annual Congress in Kolkata, there, along with the revolutionaries, Subhas opposed the proposal of dominion status. And Jawaharlal Nehru also supported Subhas in that. And Gandhiji was livid. But as was the pattern with Jawaharlal Nehru, that after initial disagreement with Gandhiji, he would always go back and surrender to whatever he said. But Subhas was a bit different. Subhas would not surrender. He would continue. So there was a big fight on this issue, and it was decided that the British government would be given 1 year uh, to explain whether to give their reaction, whether they were ready to accept this constitution or not, whether to agree to the goal of dominion status or not immediately. And if they did not agree within 1 year, then the Congress would go ahead and announce complete independence as its goal. Now, Subhas took the stand that if you ask for dominion status, the Britishers are not going to agree to it and they are going to ridicule you across the world because you don't even have the courage to ask for freedom. And when the time came in 1 year later in 1929, when Congress under Gandhi's leadership and Jawaharlal Nehru was the president that year, they announced that complete independence is the goal of the Congress. Then Subhas stood up and said that, what do you mean by having complete independence as a goal? If you have made up your mind that we want complete independence, let us just declare independence, set up a parallel government across the country, and fight it out. Now, this infuriated, as usual, the clash, the conflict aggravated, it accentuated, and Subhas was dropped from the working committee. He was a member of the working committee, he was thrown out of it. Obviously, I mean, he was too hot to handle, and the Gandhian High Command did not want him in that select coterie. So that thing continued. Then again, when the civil disobedience movement started and they were arrested, Subhas was again sent to exile in Europe because everybody was there in jail, but nobody had to be pushed out Europe. He was the only person. And that clearly shows the attitude of the British government. In 1924, he had to be sent to Mandalay and kept there without any trial, without any justice for nearly 3 years. Again, in 1933, he is sent out to Europe and kept there, prohibited from entering India. And that shows how the British government viewed him vis-a-vis the other nationalist leaders. So this line, once he reached Europe and settled and started working with other interest groups there, he developed it further. He developed a complete strategy for political action and how to get there by the methods by which independence and freedom would come. So that unnerved the British government, that angered the Communist Party because they thought that Subhas was being too radical and he was going to eat up their constituency, which is aggressive radical labor and student groups. So they were not happy with him. And of course, goes without saying that Gandhian High Command was not happy. So when he came back finally in 1936, he defied the government's ban on his entry into India. He came back and he was arrested and thrown into jail, was released after many months with his health broken down. But as soon as he was released, he started going around the country building public opinion. And then he was communicated that he was going to be the next president of the Indian National Congress. Interestingly, what we see there is Gandhi writing to Sardar Patel that I don't find Subhas trustworthy, but there is nobody else who can become the president this year. So that sets the tone. And 1938, incidentally, was a year when Subhas was not his aggressive self. In fact, he dedicated that year to build the groundwork. He had been away from the country for many years, and then when he was released, he was not well, could not give his full time and full energy to politics. So 1938 was something that when he created the framework of the subsequent years' political action, he was very clear in his ideas and he was planning to escalate the nationalist movement into another circle. Gandhi was not ready for it and he did not like those radical ideas. So next year, there was no question of re electing him. And Gandhiji wanted first Nehru to become the president. Nehru refused. Then he wanted Maulana Abul Kalam Azad to become the president. Azad refused. He wanted Patel to become the president. Patel refused. And finally, Gandhiji settled onto Pattavi Sitaramaya as his representative. And contest happened, and we all know what the result of the contest was. But as the contest happened, the entire Congress High Command, the Gandhian High Command, they could they went against him hammer and tongs. Gandhi stayed aloof, although he was against Subhas and he refused to get into the arguments and the bitter fight between the High Command and Subhas. He focused on a satyagraha in a small state like Rajkot, which incidentally ended in a bad failure and a bad defeat for Gandhi and Congress. But he made it a show that he was busy somewhere else and he did not want to get into the debate and the fight. Whereas the Gandhian High Command was fighting in the name of Gandhi. So the Panth resolution, which was imposed on Subhas after he won the election, the resolution moved by Govind Ballabh Pant, was that Subhas had to form the working committee of that year of the Congress in accordance with Gandhi's wishes. So the Congress compelled Subhas to form the working committee not according to his own wishes or according to his plan, but according to Gandhi's plan. Gandhi was away, but so the Congress Gandhian leadership was forcing Subhas to follow Gandhi's wishes, and Gandhi was telling Subhas, "I don't want to interfere. You form your own working committee." So it was a strange drama going on. There was no other way than to quit the Congress. I mean, quit the position of the president and continue as a normal congressman. To push the progressive agenda, he formed forward bloc within the Congress. But then again, Congress would not accept his radical, his aggressive action plan and created all sorts of problems for him, which Subhas also being headstrong and uncompromising in his program, he took the Congress leadership head on. So that led to his kind of expulsion. I mean, he was never expelled as such, but he was prohibited from being a member of any elected committee of the Congress. Even if it was a local committee, he could not become a part of that committee. He was not prohibited from contesting any election within the Congress. So that meant virtual expulsion. And that is when he completely took the forward bloc agenda out of Congress and pushed a mass struggle, satyagraha agenda from the second half of 1939 till July 1940 when he was again arrested and thrown into jail. So that's how it moved. And when towards 1940 he realized that staying within the country is not going to serve any purpose. He's going to rot in jail, and the Congress is not going to accept his proposal of launching a mass satyagraha or a mass uprising. He had no other option than going out of it. So that's something which he had started planning even a year ahead. And so that's how he used to plan. He never acted on impulse. He was never on the spot decision making was not his style. He was a meticulous planner. He used to think of the future, the different scenarios, different possible scenarios, and how he should act, how he should plan to encounter each scenario. So he was ready with his plan of going out of India and raising an armed struggle from abroad. That he was prepared from the end of 1939.
So what made him decide? I mean, point is that I mean you are saying right. I mean, obviously he had differences with the working committee of Congress, and obviously they were very loyal to Gandhi. So why? I mean, so obviously, I mean his days in Congress were numbered. I mean that's very obvious. So why didn't he go and create his own party along the lines of and kind of and run it according to his own wishes versus obviously he had that choice versus going abroad and then take part in raising a military to liberate the country.
Well, he did. It's not that he did. When he formed Forward Bloc, his first thing was to try and bring all the leftist parties together into one platform within the Forward Bloc. But the Congress Socialist Party refused to be a part of the Forward Bloc. The Communist Party refused to be a part of the Forward Bloc. They wanted to retain their independent entities. So what Subhash actually formed was called a Left Consolidation Committee. In, I mean, and all the leftist members were part of these members of this consolidation committee, and it worked for some time, worked well for some time. And Subhash, at that time, from the second half of 1939, We see him touring the entire country from northwest frontier province till to Madras. From end to end, he was rushing from Ahmedabad to the eastern Bengal. He was trying to create a consensus, trying to bring the progressive and radical elements together. He was sending emissaries, his former revolutionary colleagues. He was sending them to people who had been very active in the First World War and subsequently. So they were meeting with the Gadarites, they were meeting with the Savarkar brothers, they were meeting with Golwalkar, they were meeting with revolutionaries in United Provinces. So he was trying to create a network. He was trying to infiltrate the British Indian Army. And if you would have read in the book how a small contingent of the Punjab regiment actually came and met him secretly. They had a meeting, very secret meeting. And when this regiment was sent to Southeast Asia for fighting during the Second World War, they deserted the British Indian Army and joined the INA. So things were moving. But the problem happened when he was arrested in July 1940 and thrown into jail. So there was no escape. It was very clear to him that as long as the war lasted, the World War lasted, he would be in prison. And for him, the Second World War was the opportunity for India's freedom. So he could not waste it by staying within prison. He was, in his thoughts and actions, he was different from the Congress leadership, who were happy to negotiate, to go inch by inch, progress inch by inch, compromise on certain things. So for Subhas, in his own words, compromise is a sin. So he wouldn't compromise. And rather than rotting in jail for the entire duration of the war, the option for him was to go abroad and raise the army to destabilize the British Raj within India.
So how could he be so sure that, I mean, obviously, I mean, he had a plan, but would you say that how rock solid that plan was, that he will just get out of the country and then get a support and will get to create an army which can actually attack India to liberate it? I mean, it's very ambitious, and he could do it to some extent, right? I mean, there was something unfortunately happened. I mean, he couldn't fulfill, but he got within the range. So, how much of it was planned, and how much of it was actually innovated within the as it happened?
Well, he was confident of his plan, and as I said, that he was a meticulous planner. It was not happening on the spur of the moment. So he had sent out emissaries. He had sent out revolutionaries in the northwest frontier province to go and check out the route to Russia and find out pockets of support, who would support him. He sent out another of his political colleagues to Japan, who went to Japan and met the Russian ambassador, the German ambassador there, came back and reported. So this planning thing was going on. And the war had started in 1939 September. So he had time. He was watching what is going on. He was watching where the theaters where the British Indian Army were operational. And he knew that that was one of the elements where he could work with captured soldiers, because that was a thought that was not new. That was not a new thought. The thought had been there from the First World War, but nobody had been able to execute it. So he was confident that he would be able to execute it, and that is all about the man. I mean, it sounds very cliched, but for a man to go out of the country without any advance support, when he went out of the country, he did not have any advance declaration of support from the Russians or from the Germans or from the Italians or from the Japanese. He had to negotiate every step. But such was his vision, such was his force of personality. Wherever he went, whoever he met, they were so completely taken, convinced by his plan of action that they gave him their unconditional support. So just imagine in a totalitarian state, in a fascist state, in a Nazi state, They had no reason to support someone like Subhash Bose. Yet he goes and meets the Italian ambassador in Kabul, and the ambassador Petro Corradi was so overwhelmed by Subhash's plan of action, and all he had were those few weeks when he could think and prepare the plan of action. And he meets and he presents his plan of action. Corradi is absolutely impressed by it. They arrange for his passport. Corradi writes that, "Well, I wish that we had his cooperation a year ago when the war had started." So he goes to Germany. The very next day, he goes to the Foreign Office, meets the officials. They are convinced of his proposals and his plan of action. He meets the foreign minister, who himself is impressed by his plan of action. So he is negotiating constantly. He is moving around, negotiating, gathering people around him, building teams, and that is what Subhas Bose is. So when he goes to Japan, when he's sent to Japan through the submarine and reaches Tokyo, Prime Minister Tojo was not ready to meet him. It was with a lot of difficulty that one brief meeting was arranged for him. And all it took for him was that brief meeting. Within that brief meeting, Tojo was so thoroughly impressed with his plan, with his personality, that, I mean, out of the blue, he promised all cooperation, all help, unconditionally. And Subhas was blunt enough to ask him that when you promise help, it has to be unconditional. There should not be any linkages. There should not be any conditions there. Your support must be unconditional. And as the Prime Minister of Japan, when they were winning the war, Tojo promises that unconditional support. So that is what makes Subhash Bose stand out from practically all other leaders. That that ambitious thinking, outrageous planning, and meticulous planning, going out and achieving, executing his plan without any let up, without any hindrance, and constantly being at it, even though facing obstacles at every step. Things were not smooth. There were his opponents who wanted to scuttle his plans, who wanted to stop him, but he wouldn't be deterred by any of those. He went ahead with his plans, and that is what made him such a cherished leader across Southeast Asia.
Obviously, this is about organize. We have discussed his organizational skills. How he was and a planner, and but how good of a leader he was when he was running INA. Obviously, there are some. It's evident for anyone because he was immensely successful. The point is that, let's say, there are arguments like, oh, okay, was this guy a Nazi sympathizer, right? There are always detractors who find
Right.
fault within whatever happens in history, right? So was he a Nazi sympathizer? Was he was doing some kind of minority appeasement? And so you have this kind of modern twists to the story.
Well, Nazi sympathizer was a line of propaganda taken by the Allied powers. And we being too impressed with what comes from the white skin, actually, I'm sorry to use that racist term, but there's no alternative. What comes from the West is very sacred for us, has been. Times are changing now. We're challenging those narratives. And that is one of the reasons why you have your channel now. You are challenging those narratives. And that Nazi sympathizer line of propaganda was taken by the Allied powers as soon as it was known that he had reached Germany. Now, when it was natural, logical for them to take that line of propaganda because they were fighting a war. They were fighting to keep India under subjugation. They had to defeat the Axis powers. So it was wartime propaganda and all those understandable. There were a lot of untruths. But the tragedy is that that propaganda continued after the World War came to an end. And no attempt has ever been made uh, from India's behalf to counter that or to show the fallacies, to show the inaccuracy of that allegation. Because All the context, all the background, all the history is forgotten when that single allegation of being Nazi collaborator is charged against him. So when you look at Subhas Bose's political life in exile in Europe, you will see that he is, on the one hand, very appreciative of the totalitarian states. Again, the factor of discipline, how they had reorganized their society, how they were coming out of the defeats of the First World War, and how they were stimulating a sense of national prestige, self respect within the population. So these were the positive aspects that we were trying to inculcate, trying to bring into the Indian people. At the same time, he was massively critical of their racist policies. He was not afraid to criticize the German racist laws sitting in Berlin, writing to them regularly, representing the Indian students who had been heckled, harassed due to their racist mindset. So he was writing petitions for them. He was going and meeting senior officials in the foreign ministries and running a proper campaign. And he wrote in very bitter language, very bitter, upfront, and strong language. He criticized their Nazi, their fascist policies. Now, all these contexts were forgotten. Even in Forward Bloc, when he formed Forward Bloc and the World War had started, he was critical. His paper Forward Bloc was critical. His party Forward Bloc was critical of German practices in terms of laws and their racism. Militarily, he was appreciating what they were doing. Militarily, he thought there was a lesson to learn as to how they had reorganized themselves as a military power, superior military power in terms of machinery, strategy, technological development. All those were lessons that India had to learn. But he was also constantly criticizing the social policies. So he was not a follower or a fan of Nazi or fascist policies. But when this charge of Nazi collaborator, Axis collaborator is leveled against him, this background is always forgotten. In 1937, before he became the Congress president, he wrote a very long essay condemning Japanese aggression in China. So, and it can't be the case that the Japanese government was not aware of it. I mean, the Congress president designate, is writing such an important article in one of the most prestigious journals in India at that time, the Modern Review, criticizing their country. The Japanese had their ambassadors in Calcutta, and Modern Review was published from Calcutta. They would know that Subhash had been criticizing them. But everybody understands that whatever your difference is, ultimately it is your national interest that is supreme. And Subhash made this very clear in his speech as the Congress president in 1928 at the Haripura session that it is not our job to judge other countries by what they are doing in their internal matters. It is their problem. Right now, rather than moralizing, we need to think of our self interest. And that is what I keep saying that he was so ahead of his time. He gave the slogan that India must think of herself first. He gave that slogan in 1939. And we saw that slogan being picked up again and used when Prime Minister Modi campaigned in 2013. So that's like 74 years, 75 years later. So he was nearly 74 to 5 years ahead of his time. And that was the principle. That was the hallmark of his foreign policy. That we have to think of India's interest, and our primary goal is to free India. It is we are not running a he was not running a YouTube channel or was not a Twitter or Facebook critic that he would moralize and lecture rather than focus. What was the primary goal of his time of any politician? To free India, and he did what was required to free India at that time. So, I mean, there is no question of Nazi collaborator. So, if you call him Nazi collaborator, Axis collaborator, think of all the dictators with whom the United States of America have worked with. And the USA is apparently a liberal democracy. So, when they champion dictators, when they grab power, when they unseat popularly elected governments, where is that sense of morality missing? We don't get that sense of judgment when we are treating them, when we're looking at them. Where is that sense of moral outrage when the United Kingdom supports Saudi Arabia in the Human Rights Council, in the UN Human Rights Council? And at least I would give it to the British Prime Minister that Cameron was honest enough to admit in public television that he had to take that step in completely in the interests of Britain, not out of any moral obstructions. And that is what Subhas accused Jawaharlal Nehru of. He clearly wrote in his letter that, I mean, foreign policy is not made of frothy sentiments. It is hard calculations only for your national interest. And you have to do what your national interest requires. That was his policy. And the unfortunate thing is that the Allied powers propaganda, we have consumed hook, line, and sinker, and we keep repeating without any sense of where we stand, where we stood, and where our national interest lies.
Right. So let's come back to this pertinent question. Who gave us freedom? Is it Gandhi or Netaji?
Well, see, who gave us freedom is a very complicated question. Nobody gave us freedom. We won the freedom, but how did it come? Obviously, there's a long history, and thousands of people gave up their lives, sacrificed everything, and the movement was built on their bones, on their blood, on their sacrifice. And I mean, it didn't happen overnight. It took so many decades to spread the awareness, to get mass involvement. But when you look at the official narrative and when you look at the flow of events, say from 1933, what do we see? I mean, the official narrative is what I have called a Gandhian mythology. It's a construct. And it started with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's first speech from the Red Fort, where he claimed that we have achieved our freedom under the guidance of Mahatma Gandhi. And that was the beginning of this Gandhian mythology, this Gandhian construct, that our freedom came through ahimsa and satyagraha. Anybody, I mean, that's the official narrative, of course. And sometimes we see even the current government trying to give credit to the Quit India movement, saying that the Quit India movement led to India's independence. Now, how ridiculous these arguments are can be made clear in a few sentences. Firstly, if ahimsa and satyagraha were responsible for India's independence, show me one mass movement which bothered the British after 1933, when Gandhi withdrew the civil disobedience movement. That was a massive movement. Of course, yes, everybody was thrown into jail, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people went to the jail. There were movements were put down. All that happened, and there was a mass uprising. And non-violent uprising was the predominant uh, theme, motive of that movement. Absolutely right. But after 1933, show me one mass movement which was non-violent, which was Gandhian. If you talk of the 1942 Quit India movement, the moment Quit India movement was announced, and there was you have to keep in mind that there was no concrete plan for the Quit India movement. Gandhi was still toying with the idea, developing the program. He he had in his mind that he would go and meet the viceroy and discuss with him what he was going to do, just like he did in the case of the Salt March, where he wrote to the viceroy and gave his plan and everything. So here also he had something like that in his mind. But within a few hours, everybody, it was wartime. Everybody was thrown into the prison. There was no leadership. The frontline leadership was completely in jail. So the movement quickly turned violent, and when the overground movement was suppressed very quickly by the British, it went underground. So underground movement was anti-Gandhian, and violent movement was anti-Gandhian. So, by all means, by all its characteristic features, the Quit India movement, whatever was possible till the uh, starting in August and continuing till say around November, that until it was completely wiped out, it was completely non-Gandhian movement and had no long-term impact. So, what changed after the war when the Congress leaders came out of jail? We find Sardar Patel lamenting that the British had been talking that they were going to transfer power, they were going to hand over power and doing everything, do this and that. But they are not showing any signs. They are not showing any sign of handing over power. They were lamenting. The Congress had no program at that moment. Gandhiji advised them to go and do constructive work, which basically means spin charka and make khadi, prohibition movement, and anti-untouchability movement. So that was what the Congress was thinking. When the INA soldiers started coming back, were being brought back into the country, and it was announced that they would be put up on trial. And that created such a groundswell of support for the INA. It was the first time that Indians were getting to know about the existence of the INA. They were never even told about the existence of the INA. They were getting to know for the first time what Subhas Bose had done for India's freedom, that he had gone to Germany, raised an Indian legion, set up the Free India Center, a shadow government. From there, he went to Southeast Asia, set up a full scale government, set up a full scale army, fought with the Britishers in the northeast, and entered Indian territory. Had been given the charge of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So all these things had started coming up, and the effect on people was such that there was a spontaneous uprising. I mean, the pictures, some of which I have produced in the book, you will see that lakhs of people coming just to have one glimpse of the Red Fort trial heroes, the trio. So this came as a godsend to the Congress party and the other parties. And all parties utilized this sentiment to the hilt. And obviously, Congress set up a INA defense committee, they set up a committee of lawyers who defended the INA soldiers in the Red Fort trial and otherwise. And but most of it was for show. They knew that they were playing to the gallery, and practically it was a one-man show. Bhulabhai Desai, who uh, led the charge against the British government during the INA trials. But what the British government realized at that time was that they had lost control of the armed forces. It was the armed forces through which they had subjugated India. It was the armed forces through which they held such a vast swath of land and population under complete control. So, when the INA trials were going on, immediately there was, by the beginning of 1946, first there is a mutiny in the Royal Indian Air Force. As soon as that goes out, there is a mutiny in the Royal Indian Navy. So, one after the other, the British government sees the British Raj faces the blow from the armed forces, and they panic to such an extent that the commander in chief calls for reinforcements from Britain and only of European soldiers, only of British soldiers. He had lost faith on Indian soldiers, and they were talking, discussing constantly about scenarios. What would happen if there was a riot? What would the Indian soldiers do? If there was a mass uprising from among the people, the Indian soldiers in the British Indian Army would not go against their people, and they would rather turn on the Britishers. So all these things, and interestingly, at this time, I found this difference in the transfer of power volumes. But a group of British MPs go and meet Prime Minister Attlee and tells him that we have two options. Right at this moment, given the situation in India, we have only two options. Either we voluntarily move out of India or we are kicked out. And the sequence of events is very clear that the British Raj in India and the British government were so unnerved. They knew that they had lost control. And there was no way they could hold on to India anymore. So all they had to do was to find an honorable exit. And that honorable exit they found through the negotiations. And obviously, once the Congress knew that it had utilized the INA movement and was in a position to negotiate, they took it forward. And even then, the exit, which Attlee had announced in 1940 for June 1948, his deadline was June 1948 was when the Britishers would leave India. But then Mountbatten comes in and immediately advances the date by almost a year to August 1947. So all this hasty retreat, hasty exit, this was the result of one single factor at that moment, and that was the loss of trust, loss of faith in the armed forces. And that loss of faith in the armed forces happened only due to the impact of the INA, the story of the INA, and the story of Netaji. It was not the result of any nonviolent movement or satyagraha at that time. So it is for people to decide. It is the facts are clear. We have been fed with a mythology from 1947, and it's time to we broke out of that mythology. Getting independence, getting India independence was not one man's job. There, everybody, thousands of people work together. But the end game, the end game, I mean, it's like a football match where the entire team works, passes the ball, and moves up. But it is the striker at the end game who scores the goal. And that was exactly what the INA and Netaji did in expediting the exit of the British.
I mean, Congress at that point of time was very much captured by Gandhi, right? I mean, he was like the probably the de facto leader by a margin, right? So it's no surprise that after independence, I mean, all the credit goes to Gandhi because all the leaders were comes from Congress, and so it essentially becomes they were, all had lived under the shadow of Gandhi, and so obviously they are going to contribute it to Gandhi's non-violence policy and the principles. So,
But they could never forget the defeat of Tripuri, that bitterness of Tripuri, the humiliation of Tripuri. So, and that they could never forget, they could never digest. And as a result, the marginalization of Bose continued into free India. And where we find that Sardar Patel boasted in front of a foreign correspondent that I made sure that not a single INA soldier was taken back into the Indian army. So Sardar Patel was also sending out letters to provincial chief ministers, premiers, who were called at that time. They were called premiers, that praise the INA, defend them, but there is no need to praise their leader. So it is, the line was very clear.
I mean, why have this everlasting enmity or antagonism against Netaji?
I think the reason is very clear from what we discussed. It was the existence of one group versus the triumph or the superiority of another person single-handedly. And that one single individual was so superior in every matter, in every means, by every standard, that there was firstly a sense of inferiority amongst the pack who was fighting that one individual, and they had to establish their narrative, their control, and Subhas was always a threat. Subhas was always a threat to them, and that he had proved in the uh, during his entire political career, but most acutely during 1939 and 40. They had a good measure of what a what a great uh, opponent he could be. What a great uh, uh, threat he could be. And post 1945, Subhas's image had reached a place, a height which nobody could match. So it was very important to bring him down, to suppress him, to make people forget him. And at least Nehru was honest towards the fag end of his life when he spoke to one foreign correspondent and admitted that he had let Subhas down. And he made clear that the choice between me was Gandhi and Subhas, and I could never leave Gandhi. So I had to go with this. But he did admit in as many words that I did let Subhas down.
So would you say that the acceptance of Netaji would have been probably more viable if he was really not alive?
I didn't get your question.
I mean, obviously, there is a narrative, right, which they were creating. So would you say the narrative would have been more in favor of Netaji if he were not alive? Because obviously, in your book Conundrum, you talk about Netaji was alive, right? But would you
He
say
was
that?
alive, but he never came to public life. He never came back
Exactly.
to public
So
life. He
they were
stayed there.
obviously dead. So obviously, the narrative was so anti Netaji was because he was alive. So they had more threat. So the narrative was even more anti.
Obviously. There is one single fact which points to this, and nobody can contest this evidence, is that if the government did not take him as a live threat, there would have been no need for snooping on his family and his associates till the 1970s. Why would you spy, employ a team of spies across the country to find out what each of his associates is doing, what letters his family members are writing, where they are going, what they are doing, who they are meeting, and there was no need for it. And that single thing, single fact proves how mortally afraid they were uh, regarding Subhash. The problem at that time, as long as Jawaharlal Nehru was alive, is that, or even during Shastri's time probably, that they had the idea, they knew that Subhash was alive, but they had no idea where he was. It was much later that they had some idea and had established contact. Probably during the Bangladesh war, but not before that. So that is when the spying and everything stops. We see, and before that, the spying was going on. We find Nehru sending one ex-revolutionary, Surendra Mohan Ghose, to go and find out in an ashram in North Bengal whether the sadhu living there is Subhash. So if Nehru was himself very certain of his death, he would never do something like that. So obviously, the establishment was sure that he was alive, and that is why the greater effort to marginalize him. And frankly speaking, I feel that there would be tampering in official files. There would be a lot of maligning that would have happened in official files. A lot of bad things would have been written about him. So, everything possible was being done to suppress him, to put him down, to malign his image, to sully his image. So obviously, yes, that was the reason. Had he been dead in 1945, probably he would have been just given the good words and all, which Nehru did in 1947 in his first speech. He named only Subhas and Gandhi, nobody else. But then, as things became clear, they knew that he was alive and a living threat. Things started changing.
So yeah, I think for all our viewers, yeah, so obviously, after you have read this book, obviously the next book is the continuation, which is Go to Conundrum, right? This is the life of Subhas before his death, but was he really dead or was he alive? So that's a big mystery,
Yeah.
and it has been solved in the book written by Mr. Chandrachur Ghose and Mr. Anuj Dhar. So we also
But
have.
do read this book. Do read the biography. There is so much more than what we have discussed tonight because it's not possible to bring out everything. It's a 750-page book and a lot of unexplored, less known, unknown facts. I've tried to bring the equations, the dynamics between political leaders of the Congress and other political parties about Suhas's connections with the revolutionaries and within the country, outside the country. So what all was going on? A lot of things, and I've tried to make it interesting for the common reader. This is not a book written for PhD students. This is a book written for people who are interested in history but are not able to read because they find it boring or they get bored too soon. And I hope, do let me know. I hope that you will find it interesting to read the book and won't get bored about
Sure, I'm sure. I mean, both Mithilesh and I really loved reading this book. It was it was definitely eye-opening for us. I'm sure for our viewers, it will be also the same. And yeah, we keep hoping that you will come up, unearth new facts, more facts about Netaji's lives come to public viewing, and you keep updating your versions. And yeah, we get to see a second edition of it.
it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so before we leave, so we have this conundrum that we read earlier, and this is the new book that we have just finished. So I urge again to my viewers, go and buy it as soon as possible and finish it as soon as possible. So yeah, so this will change the perspective of your life, and as well as if you want to know the history of India from Subhas's point of view. The freedom struggle and even the post-independence, you'll get to know a lot of things. It's not just about the Subhas; it's about the India itself. So yeah, so that's my final word.
Thank you, Mithilesh. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.
Hopefully, you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए है नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए है नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए सुभाष जाने हिंद है सुभाष शान हिंद है सुभाष मान हिंद है सुभाष मान हिंद है सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए है नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए है नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए गली 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 अंधली हटा गली 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 आम फल लगा रही सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए शान हिंद लाएंगे वो शान हिंद लाएंगे परंदियों की काम पर कर बन के चालेंगे सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए कदा आ गया निषाद मन से सा गया एशिया का पता एशिया में आ गया सुभाष जी को जाने हिंद आ गए नाग जिससे हिंद को शान हिंद आ गए